Those lessons of history. Thank you, sir.
I call the honourable member, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this bill is an attempt to deal with some of the challenges of the growth, out-of-control growth of the financial services sector over the last couple of decades, but of course it's a long-standing problem. As the previous speaker referred to, the global financial crisis has drawn to the forefront the issue of how do we regulate the financial services sector. Not just the banking sector, but more generally the financial services sector. And the issue that stood behind the global financial crisis was fundamentally one of the expansion of money supply by the private banks. There was a phenomenal increase in global supply created by the private banks and financial institutions in the lead-up to the financial crisis. And that was part of the financial cycle that eventually led to the bust that we've seen most recently. The Bank of International Settlements, in its recent working paper, 395, looking at financial cycles, tried to analyse what stood behind the financial cycle that we've seen just come to a bust, and looking particularly at the expansion of money supply by the private banks. Now, what we've seen since then is an attempt to try to constrain the ability of that dramatic expansion that we saw. And there's strong grounds, if you like, there's strong theoretical grounds for the basis for constraining the expansion in the supply of money by the private banks. And it goes a long way back. So Henry Simons, who was, of course, one of the fathers of the Chicago School. Chicago School is what you might think of as one of the neoliberal or quite far-right members of the kind of economic theory constellation. Henry Simons said, in the very nature of the system, banks will flood the economy with money substitutes during booms. Simons was very clear that the nature of fractional reserve banking means that during the booms, the banks and other financial institutions will flood the system with money. He didn't see this as a good thing. And of course, the OECD and other countries do know that.
Point of order. The honourable member, Sam.
I understand where the member's going with this, but this has got nothing to do with the bill at hand here. And I suggest the member comes back to talking about the Financial Markets Conduct Bill. Sir.
Well, the member hasn't been going very long, but it is a narrow debate, and I'd ask the member to just try and bring it into context.
Yeah, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. So it's unfortunate that member doesn't understand the connection between the Financial Markets Conduct Bill and the regulation of the financial markets, which I guess says an awful lot about the government. And so what we've seen is how do we try to constrain those financial markets has been the challenge for governments after governments. And Henry Simons, who unfortunately the member doesn't realise is a very prominent economist and who's been very important in economic theory and stands behind a lot of the thinking that sits behind this bill, because that's what economic theory is about, but I wouldn't expect the government to know about that. Okay, so what Simon said was, he said, and why it was important to constrain the financial services, and I quote, he said, private institutions have been allowed too much freedom in determining the character of the financial system and directing the changes in the quantity of money and money substitutes. So what Simons was trying to say was that we needed greater regulation. And that has become very clear, of course, during the last decade. Could it ever become clearer in New Zealand with the collapse of all the finance companies? Of course, it's a larger problem than just the finance companies.
Order. Sorry to interrupt, Honourable Member. There's a member on my right and one on my left, and they're actually interjecting on each other, and neither of them have the floor. It's not permitted. So I call the Honourable Member, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so this bill, in some ways, is trying to deal with some of those issues, in some ways. But the question is does it fundamentally deal with some of the outstanding issues that we've got to address? It works in combination with the financial markets regulators, which is important. And so as part of looking at this bill, we've been looking at what some of the Financial Services Authority in the UK has been saying, which is Adair Turner, Lord Adair Turner, who's the chair of the Financial Services Authority in the United Kingdom, and he's the departing chair of the Financial Services Authority. What's been so interesting about the debate around the regulation of the financial services has been the development of how do we regulate the growth in private sector money, and then what is the role of public sector money and the creation of public sector money, which of course has gone under the term of quantitative easing or all sorts of other kind of names globally. And so Adair Turner, who's chair of the Mirror regulatory agency, of the one that this bill works alongside, he's been making some rather extraordinary statements in recent times about the regulation of it. And essentially what he's been saying is, and Martin Wolf, who's the lead commentator in the Financial Times, has also been making this argument, is that while it's fine through fractional reserve banking to allow the private sector banks to create money, there's also a case in certain circumstances where the public sector should be allowed to create money for public good as well. And what Martin Wolf has been talking about in particular is infrastructure investment. So he says, look, it's fine to allow the private sector banks to create money for private benefit, but in terms of the creation of money by the public sector for infrastructure, for example, that also is a legitimate purpose. Now, this is, of course, what the Green Party was proposing with the use of quantitative easing to help pay for the rebuild of Christchurch. So the regulation of the financial services sector, which this bill is part of, has cracked open a very large and interesting debate about what's the best way to regulate this sector in terms of trying to limit the growth of credit that's coming out of the sector, but also has cracked open, I think, a fascinating debate which we're struggling to have in New Zealand, which is what is the role for public sector created credit, or public printing money as the government likes to call it. And that debate, I think, is one of the defining debates of our era, because of the problems that have come out of the private sector. And so this bill is part of trying to regulate some parts of that sector. It goes alongside the debate we've been having about monetary policy, and clearly there's an overlap between the two. And it goes alongside the debate which Mr Cunliffe also referred to, which is what to do currently in terms of some of the problems in the New Zealand economy. So we've got another housing boom. How do we control that housing boom without interfering with some of the other financial services in the operation in the economy? For those of you who've seen, the Swiss Central Bank has just announced that they're going to require the private banks to keep extra capital on hand for their loans into the property sector, because the Swiss also have got a housing boom problem. So they're requiring extra capital to be put aside in order to try to take some of the heat out of their housing boom. So all of these little pieces of the puzzle, this bill and around monetary policy reform and how to deal with the housing asset bubble, are all parts of the picture. And of course the exchange rate and how to deal with the high New Zealand dollar is the other part of the picture. So we think that this is, we welcome this bill. There's a lot of good stuff in this bill. We still, however, remain concerned around the issues of criminal liabilities for directors of finance companies. Essentially, this bill weakens the current provisions. There's no other way to look at it, I don't think. In that the strict liability provisions, which currently apply to the directors of finance companies and have resulted in a number of the directors of finance companies going to jail, are essentially weakened by this bill. So the Select Committee, I think, did a good job in terms of strengthening the bill in terms of criminal liability, and I welcome the changes there. But in terms of the strict liability for the actions of the directors of finance companies, that has been taken away. Now, people will be surprised by this. So if you were one of those people who lost money in the finance companies and then you said, oh, well, at least those characters got sent to jail, the chances are that there's less likelihood they would be sent to jail under the current bill that's in front of the House than under the existing legislation, because of getting rid of the strict liability regime. So should the New Zealand Parliament be passing a law that essentially weakens the strict criminal liability regime that currently applies to the directors of finance companies, because that's essentially what we're doing. Now, the bill, of course, is a lot more than that, and to characterise the bill by just that one element I think would be unfair. Because there's a lot of really good stuff in this bill. But nonetheless, when you look at that one element of it, there's I think no question that essentially what it does is weaken that provision. and so make it less likely that the directors of finance companies would end up in jail if they misled investors. Now, the response from those who support the bill is that they say, oh, well, you can get some of your money back, civil damages. The problem for that is that a lot of the directors of these finance companies will hide their assets in trusts, and it will be very difficult for investors to get their money back from the directors of these companies. And so clearly there needs to be some work to fix up the trust regime, the legal framework around trusts. But it means that under this current bill, those who say, oh, well, you can always sue the directors to get your money back, actually the directors won't necessarily have enough money, and the money will be hidden away in trusts, so it'll be hard to access. Thank you, Mr Speaker. For that reason, we won't be supporting this bill.
I call the honourable member Peseta Sam Lotu-Iiga.
Well, thank